Hi, I'm Megan. Welcome to today's live reading of Wild Lavender by Nicole E. Kelleher, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Join me. Prologue. In the 31st year of the Great Peace in the realm of King Godwin, Lady Aurelia. Her escape had been easy. The real challenge would be sneaking back into their family's quarters. But even the risk of inciting her mother's wrath had been worth it. When would she ever be at high court again and have a chance to see the royal stables? Navigating the many corridors of the castle and detective was simple enough. Her training included the art of stealth. And as long as her younger sister Claire had not awakened and tattled on her, none would be the wiser. Voices brought her back on point, and she slowed her pace as she approached the king's royal hall. It seemed the lords and ladies at court never slept, preferring rather their games and flirtations. Light spilled across the stone floor in a broadening wedge. She ducked behind a tapestry and flattened herself against the wall, turning her toes inwards lest they peek from beneath the hanging and betray her presence. Just in time, she thought, as she heard the gentle patter of a lady's slippers racing past. When the light in the corridor dimmed, she knew the royal hall's door had been closed once more. Her heart galloped in her breast as she darted past. The safety of her room was nigh, only two more hopefully deserted corridors and a dark stairwell, and no one would know of her forbidden adventure. She was congratulating herself on her own success when an arm struck out across her path. The collision, her breath exploded from her chest with an unladylike oof, and before she could collect herself, she was drawn into an alcove and pressed against its wall. Her mind reacted instinctively, gauging all the possible means of escape. Damn her long cloak, for it impeded her from kicking out at the man. Patience, she cautioned herself, an opportunity would come. Shh, he whispered to her. You'll wake the castle. She couldn't explain why, but his voice bored into her heart and soul, resonating deep within her. She stretched to get a look over his shoulder to determine if they were truly alone, her height for once being advantage. But this man, as she pushed ineffectually at his broad chest, towered over her. Exposing her neck to him had been a crucial error on her part, and in the dark of the alcove, she saw the outlines of his head dip down. Lips and whiskers met her skin, creating the most unusual sensation. Far from unpleasant, she found herself tilting her head to give him better access. It was then that she noticed how hard the muscles of his chest felt under her fingers, and she pressed her palms against the beat of the heart racing in time with hers. She knew she should stop him, and she would soon. It must have been the thrill of her earlier foray, she determined, that kept her from calling out. She was 18, after all, well past being old enough to marry, though not yet promised. She lost the thread of her thoughts when his fingers traced down her back and his lips lifted to nibble at the bare lobe of her ear. His hands came around to open her cloak. He nipped gently along her jaw, searching for her lips, while his fingers encircled her waist. She had never been kissed before, though a few young men had tried. Somehow this was different, and her anticipation grew. One kiss couldn't hurt. Then she would drive her knee up and escape, and if that didn't work, she always had her dagger. His lips were close to hers. She held her breath, but no kiss was forthcoming, and when the warmth of his exhalation cooled, her eyelids fluttered open. Eyes as dark as sin stared back at her. What game is this? The stranger seethed under his breath, and she felt the sting of each word. He must have thought her frightened, for he swore an oath. Do you comprehend how dangerous? He started, taking a step back, and then closed his mouth as she edged warily past him. You need not worry, I am no ravager of maidens. He eased farther away, trying and failing to appear less menacing. Only she was anything but daunted, and he must have sensed her mettle, for his appraising gaze washed over her. He leaned out of the alcove and peered down the deserted passageway, and she could tell from his bearing that he was a young nobleman. Well, as you are not who you are supposed to be, he scolded, you best run along. She felt her face go hot, and she narrowed her eyes at him in what she hoped was a scathing look. He mirrored her expression and raised his eyebrow in amusement. She gave him a wide berth, skirted the recesses, and backed her way down the corridor, glaring at him even as she turned to flee. A moment, he called to her as she stopped, shifted her weight to her toes, poised to leap away like a deer if necessary. Tell me your name. Anna, she said breathlessly, her grin as mischievous as it was sweet. His returned smile, barely visible in the dim corridor, had her heart tripping in time with her feet as she dashed away. I'm Lar, he called after her, but she didn't quite hear. She turned to ask, but then when noticed a flickering light approaching from the opposite direction, she realized that fortune was nipping at her heels. Every second she delayed was a risk that her nighttime escapade would be reported to her mother, so instead she spun around and raced to her quarters. Chapter 1, The Journey, 2 years later. They headed north in the old forest, 6 men in the Aubrianne of Chevalian. Well, no longer of Chevalian. She was now the Lady of Stolweg. Her husband of half a day, Lord Roger, rode next to her. Much like their betrothal and wedding, their pace was quick and without impediment. The fields and crops passed behind them as the distance remaining to the Chevalian forest shortened, bringing the end of her family's land and the border of her new home ever closer. No one in their party spoke, leaving Aubrianne to her thoughts. She allowed her steed to fall back from her husband so as to gaze discreetly at his form. Like everything else about him, his profile was perfect. His nose was straight and sharp, but not pointed. His mouth was set in a firm line with lips that were neither too full nor too thin. Strangely, the bright day did nothing to lighten his blonde hair. Instead, his golden streaks deepened in the sun. Aubrianne was reminded of harvest time at Chevalian, when the wind blew over the wheat fields and caused the heavy stalks to undulate and shine. She wanted to reach out and touch his hair, knowing that the strands would not feel silky like so many with the fair coloring, but strong and thick. Like the wheat, it would bend, it would not yield. She remembered the first time she had seen him. It seemed like years ago, but in truth it was only months. It had been a beautiful day, much like this one. She and her destrier, Tullian, had been galloping for the sheer, heart-bursting joy of speed. Tullian, over 18 hands, had been a gray blur against emerald pastures. His ash-colored coat was dappled with charcoal smudges, as if he rolled in the sooty remains of a campfire. His mane, tail, and fetlocks were as dark as charred wood. Aubrianne remembered how her long braid had trailed behind in the aftermath of their passage and how she had laughed aloud. Anywhere else in the realm, she and her warhorse would have seemed outrageous, but not at Chevalian. The people of Chevalian were horse folk, with no male heir to carry on generations of horse breeding and training skills. Her father had turned to Aubrianne, ensuring that the family's rigorously guarded secrets of producing the finest destriers would not be lost. No other family in the known realms could be trusted to breed the mounts destined for the king and his royal guard. It came as no surprise that Anna, as her family called her, had a way with the horses not seen since the days of her great-grandfather. Horses were in her blood. She smiled at the memory of Tullian's hooves pounding the fertile ground. The air around them had been filled with the sounds of rending stem and root, and grating horseshoe and soil. Wild grass and loam had exploded from below them like shot from a trebuchet, great clouds flung to the sky. Her mother had warned her to remain near the castle that day, but Aubrianne had never been one to listen to another's counsel. It hadn't been 10:30 in the morning when she turned back. Hours yet remained before the first meeting of the betrothed. Returning from her ride, she had spared only a moment to check her appearance, mud-spattered. At least her mouth was clean, she had thought, and then grimaced, feeling the grit in her teeth. She had felt the drag of decorum, growing stronger with each stride closer to the castle, her momentary sense of freedom gone. In one last act of defiance, she opened her arms and embraced the buffeting wind. All those months ago, Anna hadn't been surprised that her parents had arranged her marriage. At the time, she had only thought her wedding would be more romantic. Perhaps to the dark and dangerous lord who had haunted her dreams for the last 2 years. Hadn't her grandmother promised that love would find her? A ghost of a smile touched her lips as she continued to reminisce about that morning when she nudged Twillian into a high-stepping trot as they entered the confines of Chevlon's walls, only to find her intended groom waiting in the courtyard and her impatient mother next to him. Under her mother's glare, Aubrianne had remembered herself and quickly masked her doe-eyed surprise at seeing such a well-made man. She sat taller in her saddle under his scrutiny. There had been a flash of disapproval in his eyes, but then he strode forward to greet her with a smile. The sound of stumbling hoof on rot drew Aubrianne from her reverie. Her husband was still ahead of her, paying her no mind. He would be surprised if he knew just how different she really was from all the other women. Yes, she knew how to be a chatelaine. Her mother had made sure her instruction was complete. As such, she was well versed in the healing arts, for it would be her duty to help the sick and wounded of her new home. Additional lessons included a thorough history of Aurelia and Niflheim, two countries separated by the Western Sea. It had been the great war between these two realms that had once shaped the kingdom of Aurelia. Once there had been many territories, all ruled by lesser kings, but to overcome the powerful and united Niflheim, a high king had been chosen. His descendant, King Godwin, now sat upon the throne. Of the 22 regions that had once existed, only 8 remained. Most had been absorbed into the area surrounding the King's Glen, King Godwin's seat. Although they each kept their own castles, the lords of these smallholds spent much of their time at court. The remaining 8 regions accounted for more than 2/3 of the realm, the largest being Whitmarsh. Stolweg, to which this road now led, was second in size. Each region had its own castle and center of commerce and trade, and some of the coastal territories boasted multiple smaller fortresses. Their lords and ladies were the meters of both justice and care. Anna sat straighter in her saddle. She was the Lady of Stolweg now, and its import finally penetrated her mind. Of her education, her husband knew that she was practiced in such skills as were needed to run his castle, Stolweg Keep. And he also knew of her unconventional abilities with the horses. In fact, that was one of his reasons for wishing their union. For with their marriage, he had secured what no one else in the realm had, the secrets of breeding and training Chevalian Destiers. In return, he had loaned her father enough coin to keep Chevalian from ruin. The years of peace between Aurelia and the kingdom of Niflheim had whittled away her family's once great fortune. With no battles to be fought, the demand for war steeds had dwindled, and King Godwin no longer required stables of Destiers for his lords and royal guard. Roger had explained that the king was establishing a series of tournaments to keep the many unladen noblemen in Aurelia occupied, and those men would require proper mounts. Aubrianne. It took her a moment to realize that she was being addressed. She wasn't accustomed to the more formal moniker. Like her family, the people at Chevalian simply called her Anna. From every word spoken to her thus far, Roger was proving himself to be a man who preferred formality. He dropped back next to her. We shall make camp in a few hours. His expression was mild, but his eyes searched her face. What has occupied your thoughts so thoroughly? I was thinking of the King's tournament, she replied. Will you compete? Most likely, he answered. Of course, doing so means I will have to leave Stolweg Keep often. Your mother assured me that you were up to running of the castle in my absence, and you have yet to meet my arms master, Celiac. He is quite capable. Roger looked back at his men. Everyone at Stolweg excels at their assigned duties. You see, even my stableman has your dowry in hand. Anna regards Giles with an assessing eye. The stable master was doing well. It was no easy task controlling her dowry, 5 prime broodmares from Chevalian. When she turned back to Roger, he had pulled ahead once more, leaving her to her thoughts. Her husband seemed like a traditional man, one who would want his wife in her proper place, a true lady to run his castle. He impressed her as being practical both in mind and in heart. Despite this conservative nature, he had chosen her, a woman more adept to ride astride a horse than side saddle as she did now. For once, Anna would heed her mother's advice and not divulge her other talents to Roger. The tools of her unorthodox training were following behind in the cart, concealed in a secret compartment in one of her trunks. Armor, centuries old, handed down through the generations of mothers and daughters. Not only armor, but sword and shield too, specially balanced for a woman, and bow and quiver. Few knew of Anna's ancestors, for their names had changed as they married into other noble families across Aurelia, but Anna could recite them. She had studied every one of these leaders who had risen to fight alongside men in the upheavals that had peppered the history of the realm. From her father's line, she'd inherited her innate ability with horses and her favorite weapon, a dagger once wielded by her father's father. But it was her mother's size which had gifted her with her talent for weaponry, the likes of which hadn't been witnessed since her great-great-grandmother. She prayed that her mastery of these skills did not portend some major change in the realm.